I'll mention it, but probably not gonna say the way you just said it, because my work is out there, people running past it, but no, she's not here. I'll give her a call. Somebody make sure.
No, I want to. It'll be like little.
We can avoid that. Thank you a lot, appreciate it.
I know. Oh, thank you.
He actually was about to chase it with her.
She's getting all goofy.
Like walking on the ceiling. It's crazy. It's crazy.
He's in the
When
basement.
are they leaving? Charlie goes to Norwich with us. She's a teacher last year. But elementary,
Because they only go up to 8. Maybe.
Almost.
If, I don't know, for sure it depends on scholarships.
Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
14.
Good morning.
Oh, sure. Now they'll find out what
His parents,
Virginia. Yes. I was close to her. Good morning.
that's what they do. And I'm amazed.
My boss just sends pictures of where we see them. Take pictures. They have friends. I'm not ready.
Very sweet.
And I live on the third floor.
I think it's, I've done well, no, that part we didn't have, because we had about 7 parking. That rest of the day, we go. You're going to the I know, I said, I don't know, because it was different than the No, it just doesn't work that way. Obviously.
The same bag. Hey, John. Okay.
It's just
Are you going to be around
50 years.
on Friday?
50 years.
Let me know.
They fly by?
I'll tell you why. Susan and I goes by.
Did they fly by?
She thought broke.
To maintain everything.
Seems like, yes, so.
Oh, well, let me tell Carol.
Candy's gonna help on Friday, so we're all set.
Thank you.
No.
Stuart, thank you. Romances and
It
serenades.
was like.
I talked to Fred Livingstone the other day and talked to him. They're doing fine. Fred's 96.
Right.
I was a little worried that, thing. Yeah.
But it's anyways.
I don't know what I did. Well, good morning, Shabbat Shalom to everybody.
Happy birthday.
What do you think this is?
Personally, I'd unplug it.
What's that?
I'd unplug it.
You can unplug it. If we unplug it, then the live streamers won't hear, right? Can you just stand here? Can you stay here? Here it comes. Yeah. Yeah. So. Here it comes. I can unplug it from the plug back there. Should I do that?
Well, you moved the podium forward. Let's see. If we move it back,
Pull it back?
yeah.
Think that did something?
I don't know. Maybe.
We'll hope for the best. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, good morning again. We'll hope for the best here. If it continues, I guess we'll unplug it, but then... I'm sorry? No, we just, Stuart asked me to just move this back. Okay, well, we're going to try our best. Good morning, and those of you who are live streaming, we're glad to have you. We're passing around one of our sign-up sheets again for bagel pickup. If you would, it would be great if you signed up to do this. I know we're a smaller number now that we're divided into two groups, those who are here and those who are live streaming. But it would be great if we could fill that up so that we have our bagels every week. And if not, we'll try to find another way. Speaking of that, thank you to Jackie Weiner for our bagel sponsorship this morning, and George and Fran Morris for sponsoring the live streaming, and to Russell Ben-Giat for doing 2 pickups. 1 bagels and 1 his wife. Extra credit. Okay, very good. But thanks for your sponsorship of these things. Let's continue with our blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through his commandments and joining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. just one announcement before I forget. Next week, no Torah study. You know, this is the Silver Scholar Weekend. And in the place of Torah study will be a panel discussion group next Saturday morning. I take it right here. I believe it begins at 10 o'clock. Does it? Okay, 10 o'clock right here. And the big festivities the night before, Friday night. So if you're interested, Martin Indek is going to be the featured speaker. And I think it should be a lovely evening of celebrating the 75th anniversary of Abba Hillel Silver's speech to the United Nations promoting the acceptance of the State of Israel's Declaration of Independence, or at least forecasting it, the United Nations' support of Israeli independence. So that's next Saturday, and then the Saturday after that we'll be here. So I passed around a sheet. I hope you all have this. I'm preparing a bit for a couple of talks I'm giving for the Andy Warhol series. Each of the portraits are going to be represented, or at least interpreted, maybe is the way of saying it, by some kind of a program. And I'm going to be doing two of them, one on Franz Kafka and one on the Marx Brothers. Polar opposites. Franz Kafka probably had no sense of humor whatsoever. But he was a profound thinker. So I am an author. So I'm doing some preparation now for that talk, and it's been really illuminating and wonderful to reread some of Kafka's writings and some commentary on it. And along the way, I came across an interesting, very short story, which is Kafka's interpretation of the Tower of Babel story, which I've brought for us this morning. Not only is it inherently interesting, but I think it has something to do with one of our questions for this period of our reading of the Torah portions, and that is, in what way is the call and response of Abraham a response to the dilemmas and problems outlined in the first 11 chapters of Genesis? So that's been an important theme for us now. Why these 11 chapters? And I think the answer in general is that before we can understand what the call of Abraham is about, we have to see what it is that are the dilemmas and the problems that have been outlined in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And that's what we're working on now, even though we're always going to be outpaced by the Torah portions, which move along, whether we're moving along with them or not. So we are nice and behind already. We're at Toldot, which is the beginning of the story of Jacob and Esau, beginning in chapter 25. And lo and behold, we're still back there in the Abraham story. But we're going to try to keep up, but we're not going to be obsessive about it because there are so many things to look at. So what I want to do here is to go back to the Tower of Babel story, which is the last story of these first 11 chapters, and therefore we might consider them to be kind of a climax of the spinning out of control, I might say, of the first 11 chapters. So what I want to do and read chapter 11, the first 9 verses. You can see what happens after the Tower of Babel story, beginning in verse 10, is a long genealogy leading inexorably to Abraham, who is on this journey with his family and all of a sudden called by God. So let's look at the Tower of Babel story, and then we're going to look at this sheet that I've handed out. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them hard." Bricks served them as stone, bitumen served them as mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build us a city and a tower with its top in the sky, to make a name for ourselves, else we shall be scattered all over the world." The Lord came down and looked, and looked at the city and the tower that man had built. And the Lord said, "If as one people with one language," okay, the presupposition here is, or the assertion, is that at this point the people are unified, both as a group and in terms of their one language. "If as one people with one language for all, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they may propose to do will be out of their reach. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so that they shall not understand one another's speech." Thus the Lord scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confounded the speech of the whole earth. And from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Okay? From unity, of presence, of group, of language, now things are all thrown into disarray. So let's turn to this sheet here. And at the beginning, I have just copied something from an interesting book by Robert Alter. You can see it cited at the bottom of that first paragraph. Necessary Angels, Tradition and Modernity in Kafka, Binyamin, and Sholem, three of the great thinkers, novelist, critic, historian of the 20th century. And here's what Sholem says. Gershom Scholem, this is Alter's voice, in a 1974 address to the Bavarian Academy of the Arts, explained to his German audience that there were only 3 books that he had truly read, which is to say, reading as an interpreter, over and over with an open heart and in spiritual tension. Don't you love that phrase? An open heart and spiritual tension. That is one of the things I think that Alter is getting at here, is that these great books in the Jewish tradition are themselves filled with spiritual tension, and not just a kind of uniform understanding of the nature of things. These 3 bodies of texts were the Hebrew Bible, the Zohar, written in Aramaic, and one set of works in German, the collected writings of Franz Kafka. Scholem observes that this last group of texts exhibits a profound, if peculiar, affinity with the first 2, which he characterizes as follows. In substantial portions of his writing, Kafka's, there is a kind of canonicity. That is, these books, I think Scholem is saying, have the status of canon. And we know the word canon means standard. Standard by which other things are judged. Okay? So that what Scholem feels is that along with the Bible and the Zohar, the basic book of Jewish mysticism, sits Kafka's writings. In substantial portions of his writing, there is a kind of canonicity, and now Scholem defines what canon means. That is to say, they are open to infinite interpretation. That's an interesting definition of canon, isn't it? Infinitely interpretable, and therefore inexhaustible, and therefore always relevant down through the ages, which in its infinite interpretability, each generation is going to find its own understanding or access to that text. Going back. In substantial portions of Kafka's writing, there's a kind of canonicity, that is to say, They're open to infinite interpretation. And many of them, especially the most impressive of them, Kafka's writings, constitute in themselves acts of interpretation. Notice, interpretation is canon. Some interpretations themselves have the status, for some readers, of being canonical. The historical distribution and differing character of these three instances of Jewish canon chosen by Sholem are probably not accidental. The Bible, of course, is the set of texts that stands at the moment of spiritual origins. It is the ultimate overflowing, that's such a key word, overflowing source. The writings intensely interpreted by all subsequent generations as authoritative revelation. Isn't this great, actually? That the Bible has been seen down through the generations as in need of interpretation because of a kind of assumption, because of the assuming that it is an authoritative revelation. Okay? So that's a traditional way of saying it. A non-traditional way of saying it would be, a non-traditional way, that as we read the biblical text, we can see its overwhelming richness, its susceptibility to a variety of interpretations, to it the impossibility of reducing it to one interpretation, which makes it canonical not because we see it as revelation, although we might, but because in the reading of it, we see its inexhaustibility. And therefore it becomes for us the canonical text. This is the difference structurally by the foundation of an authoritative text in what happened before it or what is in it. Sholem is arguing here that it's always been interpreted because of what came before, an act of divine revelation. It is the result of a prior act. A modern interpretation is we need not make that assumption because we can look at the text in its own terms, what it is, and not from whence it came, and see it as authoritative for us. In other words, I think that Sholem's idea here of authoritative revelation does not need to be assumed for the modern reader who finds that notion problematic. I'm not denying its existence, just that there's another way of looking at it. The Zohar, I'm back to this piece, of all the major texts of post-biblical tradition, is the one that pushes interpretation to its most daring extremes, that constitutes the most radical possibility of reinterpretation, and now comes a crucial addition, in the midst of devout confirmation of the authority of the first revelation. You see what is being said here? That the Zohar, which pushes the understanding so far, nevertheless is also grounded in the sense of the ultimate, unique authority of biblical revelation. And notice the paradox. Assuming that the Bible is the product of revelation, nevertheless, we're going to, the authors of the Zohar, find some things in that text that seem impossible to prior readers. You can't find this in that text. And yet they have found things that had seemed to others, and certainly the Hasidic tradition, the mystical tradition, has been resisted by other elements of the Jewish tradition. We claim that all of those things, the various aspects of God and so on, are in the text, even though they don't seem to be there. This is the reason, I think, according to Sholem, that he thinks of the Zohar as one of the fundamental texts, because it shows us how much can be gotten out of this biblical text. And one wonders just what assumption needs to be made in order to work so hard to get that interpretation. They must really have believed that this was the very Word of God, and therefore it deserves ongoing, inexhaustible scrutiny. It's the power of this assumption, which is hard for some of us to make, and I've tried to argue there are other ways. Okay, so Kafka, see where I am, the exemplary Jewish modernist, raises fundamental questions about the validity of interpretation, conjures with the vertiginous, that's vertigo, the vertiginous possibility that we may be at the end of the line of interpretation, revelation now forever receding from us. Okay? So Kafka, this claim asserts, is in this line of interpreters, though revelation, according to Kafka, has been blocked off from us. Those of you who read The Trial know that at the end, in the chapter entitled Before the Law, Kay, the protagonist, is standing on the outside of the cave, guarded by a certain person, and discovers that, yes, there is the law, but it's not available to us. It may be, this is a question of interpretation. The law may be there still, but we can't get to it anymore. So there is this modernist idea that some of the assumptions of traditional Judaism, like revelation, are now closed off to us. But nevertheless, Kafka is still enamored of the Bible and writes many interpretations of it. Okay? So a modernist rejecting certain assumptions, but nevertheless as astute and eager a reader of the Bible as any traditionalist. Okay? Sholem needed all three of these instances of canonicity to define the limits of his own spiritual world. Gershom Scholem, some of you know who that is, of the founder, really, of the modern study of Jewish mysticism. His belief was that Jewish mysticism is at the very heart of what Judaism always has been, even though it's been marginalized by traditional readers. The power to compel interpretation put forth by Sholem as the chief criterion of canonicity is, as we shall see, one of the governing assumptions of his thinking about tradition. I find that paragraph really quite astonishing and rich. So we want to look now at his short story. This is the whole story here and on the back page with the title, The City Coat of Arms. So I want to quote Alter again from another of his books, the book with the title Canon and Creativity. I'm going to quote it, you don't have it. If you begin work with the working assumption that this particular text, namely the Bible, which as a canonical text is, here are three adjectives, compact, enigmatic, and charged with a sense of authority. That's pretty rich, isn't it? The Bible is compact, compressed. It doesn't say everything it intends. It's enigmatic. We have found that. What's the meaning of the binding of Isaac story? And charged with a sense of authority. I certainly feel that. And I think over the years we've come to feel it collectively. That there's something about the biblical text that seems authoritative to us and therefore worth coming back to over and over and over again. Charged with a sense of authority, which may be divinely revealed, if you start with that assumption, then you proceed to exert terrific interpretive pressure on the text in order to unlock the truth or multiple truths it holds for you. Don't you love that phrase? To exert terrific interpretive pressure on the text required to liberate what it has for us. And that Kafka found the hypothesis of Scripture as revealed truth alluring. It's not that he believed it, but he found it potent. As a continuing thought experiment that Kafka undertook, a thought experiment that both afforded an expression to his theological searching and nourished his imaginative work as a writer of fiction. One could spend a long time on those words, really, couldn't one? So, now let's look at his short story on the Tower of Babel. At first, all the arrangements for building the Tower of Babel were characterized by fairly good order. Indeed, the order was perhaps too perfect. Too much thought was given to guides, interpreters, accommodations for the workmen, and roads of communication, as if there were centuries before one to do the work in. Okay? Notice the curious word in what I just read, the word interpreters. In German, Dolmetscher. Dolmetscher also means translator. Why does a community such as the one the biblical story brings to us need interpreters? It's as if the plurality of languages is in Kafka's story already present. In the biblical story, it comes as punishment by a God who comes down as the people are going up. Okay? So in the biblical story, we have a kind of ideal set of circumstances ruined by their overweening, by their excessive attempt to exceed the limits of human possibility. And God doesn't like this and scatters them. Kafka's story, his interpretation, which takes the Tower of Babel story very seriously, radically changes it already. Multiplicity is already present, let's say, in the human condition. Okay, let me read the sentence again because you can see that there's great delay in the building of the tower. So let me start again. At first, all arrangements for building the Tower of Babel were characterized by fairly good order. Indeed, the order was perhaps too perfect. They were striving for too perfect a sense of order. Too much thought was given to guides, interpreters, accommodations for the workmen, and roads of communication, as if there were centuries before one to do the work in. We could delay it. In fact, the general opinion at that time was that one simply could not build too slowly. Human procrastination. A very little insistence on this would have sufficed to make one hesitate to lay the foundations at all. People argued in this way. The essential thing in the whole business is the idea of building a tower that will reach to heaven. In comparison with that idea, everything else was secondary. The idea, by the way, this is where Kafka gets to the heart of the biblical story, which he is transforming. In other words, he takes the biblical story with the utmost seriousness, but interprets it in a surprising way. In comparison with that idea, everything else is secondary. The idea, once seized in its magnitude, can never vanish again. So long as there are men on earth, there will be also the irresistible desire to complete the building. What's this about? It's not just about the Babylonites. It's about us. It's about human nature. The building itself is not completed. We are always at work at completing it. That is, we're always at work in the gesture of exceeding what is possible for human beings. That being, in other words, Kafka is universalizing this. And he's universalizing it in terms of human nature and human possibility. That being so, however, one need have no anxiety about the future. Even though it's going to be delayed and delayed forever, no anxiety. But on the contrary, human knowledge is increasing. The art of building has made progress and will make further progress. A piece of work which takes us a year may perhaps be done in half the time in another 100 years. And better done too, more enduringly. So why exert oneself to the extreme limit of one's present powers? There would be some sense in doing that only if it were likely that the tower could be completed in one generation. But that is beyond all hope. It is far more likely that the next generation, with their perfected knowledge, will find the work of their predecessors bad and tear down what has been built so as to begin anew. Human nature never changes. The task is always the same. But technology improves. And technology is a double-edged gift, right? It helps us and it hurts us. Because with the increase in technology, we tear down already what has already been built in order to build something again. Such thoughts paralyzed people's powers. And so they troubled less about the tower than the construction of a city for the workman. Every nationality, they're already different peoples, different nations. God hasn't come down yet. These are the initial conditions of the human condition. Every nationality wanted the finest quarter for itself, and this gave rise to disputes, which developed into bloody conflicts. In other words, differences among peoples are the cause of the aborted attempt to build the tower, and not as the result of building the tower. Differences precede the building, not as God comes down and causes differentiation. These conflicts never came to an end. To the leaders, they were a new proof that in the absence of the necessary unity, the building of the tower must be done very slowly, or indeed preferably postponed until universal peace was declared. Not achieved, declared. But in other words, notice that this is a naturalistic explanation of the problem, not a supernaturalist explanation. But the time was spent not only in conflict, the town was embellished in the intervals. And this, unfortunately enough, evoked fresh envy and fresh conflict. In this fashion, the age of the first generation went past, but none of the succeeding ones showed any difference, except that technical skill increased, and with it, occasion for conflict. To this must be added that the second or third generation had already recognized the senselessness of building, of building a heaven-reaching tower. But by that time, everybody was too deeply involved to leave the city. Notice Kafka's issue is both exceeding human possibility and also the problem of urbanization, where people get together not to create great culture, but to engage in conflict with one another. All the legends, by the way, what's this amount to here? It amounts to despair. That we've got this project which we're not making any progress on, and meanwhile technology increases, and so does conflict, and that's the nature of things. All the legends and songs that came to birth in that city are filled with longing for the prophesied day when the city would be destroyed by 5 successive blows from a gigantic fist. It is for that reason, too, that the city has a closed fist on its coat of arms. Just like a medieval city, which has a coat of arms with an emblem which asserts its essence. And what is this about? It's an apocalyptic vision. That despair leads to a sense that there can be no improvement. All we can hope for is destruction. Maybe we can start again. Okay? So that's Kafka on the Tower of Babel. You can see how amazingly creative this is. But don't you also see, and one of the reasons I brought it, not only for its intrinsic interest, but because Kafka really does emphasize the problem with which the Bible leaves us at the end of chapter 11. Now in wholly human terms, right? One of the things we notice about the first 11 chapters is that human beings, though there is a God in that universe, of course, the human beings are left uninstructed. There's no instruction about how to act well. And this is one of the things that the call of Abraham immediately tries to resolve. And that's a point that Kafka makes in naturalistic terms here. That left to ourselves, all we can come to is a sense of despair. Patty?
I've always looked at the Babel story as just an explanation in the Bible for why there's different groups of people. That's sort of a superficial reading of it.
No, not at all.
But I think the most potent phrase is that God recognized that they're building this tower to make a name for themselves. And in that way, this story is exactly the same. Kafka is using that sort of nationalistic pride, the envy and competition between people as the real downfall, leading to despair, the way you're putting it. But unity and community seem to be what the goal should be.
Yeah.
In both stories.
Right.
Even though God scatters everybody and they don't turn into each other in conflict, the scattering itself will lead to conflict because then people are separated and that community has now been broken.
So what are you saying here? That what?
The moral of both stories is pride leads to downfall, and the goal should be people to work together, but not to make a name for themselves or to establish different quarters in the city. better than the other, but to work together.
Which version, the Bible's or Kafka's, is the more hopeful?
I think they both live either scattered or in conflict, which to me, I'm saying is a parallel situation. But to bring people back together again.
What's the source of the conflict or spreading out? What's the source of that in the Bible? God.
It seems like a punishment.
It's a punishment.
Right.
What's the source of it in the Kafka legend?
Human nature.
Human nature.
Yeah.
And therefore the biblical story is more hopeful.
I think
Because
so. Yeah. I
what
think
God
so.
create.
The coat of arms is establishing that this is the way we are, and we're just going to wait until everything's destroyed.
So the biblical story suggests that what God's self created can be uncreated. Because there's an initial unity which has been overthrown by an act of God, who nevertheless could find ways to bring us back together again. Whereas Kafka seems to suggest that once you articulate human nature and see what it is, that's the end of the matter. Because there is no transcendent force to rectify the situation. So Kafka's is the more despairing, but it seems to me focuses more intensely on the problem. The problem is us. And is there a way out of this malaise? Kafka seems to suggest no, and maybe that's part of his skepticism, his pessimism. Nevertheless, he expresses it by means of taking the biblical story, both with great seriousness and with the capacity to interpret it the way he wants to interpret it, which does yield another way of seeing that story. Scott?
There's two things I wanted to mention. One, the emphasis in Kafka's version is the differences in human beings. Is the emphasis versus the single purpose of building this tower, right? Building to have this unity. Whereas in the Bible, the differences are immaterial. They seem to be unified in a purpose, but it is the wrong purpose.
Yeah.
So, that has to be resolved as a difference between the two versions. I had a question though, and I apologize, I was late if you already discussed it, but did Kafka ever comment on this? What is the five? What's the significance of five blows or whatever it is?
Yeah, right. I don't know. I mean, I've not read widely about the interpretation of this. I'm sure there are others than I've read. I don't know. Any thought?
No, I was very curious about it.
Yeah.
I tried to count, our fathers, but there's four there.
Yeah, that's true.
Doesn't quite work.
5 books of Moses. I don't know. Bennett?
I don't know the significance of this, but the endings are entirely opposite for the two stories. In the Genesis story, God scatters all these people so that they're spread across the earth, and they supposedly, I guess, would found their own cities and not have a conflict because they would be unified again. In the Kafka story, they're frustrated and remain in one location and don't prosper at all, I assume. They just exist, so to speak.
Yeah.
I don't know the significance of the two endings.
What's when you say they're in one place, what is that one place?
Whatever this city was, it was called Babel, I guess.
Don't you think the place is everywhere?
No, I don't get that. I don't get the impression that they just hung around where they were.
Yeah, if he's making a point here about the human condition and human nature and the way in which unrealized purposes, we have this goal, but we constantly are fighting with one another which impedes the realization of the goal. And that leads to skepticism and despair. That would seem to me to be a comment about the human condition. And therefore, Babel is really, in a sense, nowhere. Erewhon, you remember that dystopian novel? Yeah, Erewhon. Yes, Maya?
I think that if you put together the first story of the exile from Eden and Babel, it's the same common denominator. So to borrow from the Greeks, it's hubris.
To what?
To borrow from the Greeks, it's the sin of hubris.
Yeah, the sin of hubris, right. Yeah, right. No, that's exactly. And both lead to exile.
Yes.
Of course, both are directed by the divine hand. And we've made the point before that even though Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden is not destroyed. And therefore the Bible leaves open hope of some kind of return to the Garden of Eden, either literally or figuratively. And we've talked a little bit about what Eden might become in biblical literature, the land of milk and honey. A community which cares for the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. The prophetic notion of Eden. Of course, it can be understood as life after death, though the Bible doesn't really go there until the very, very end of biblical literature. So that inherently, the biblical telling of these stories has an element of hopefulness to it. Where it seems to me that the Kafka story does not. Because all they can hope for is, when is this going to be destroyed? Maybe we can start again, or maybe not. Gary?
I'm not sure how you come to that interpretation. Where is the hopefulness?
Yeah, where is the hopefulness? Maybe I have to abandon that.
But I would also say, you brought this up initially about the languages.
Yeah.
But apparently, if you go back to the beginning of chapter 10, it says here, from these the maritime nations branched out. These are the descendants of Jephthah by their lands, each with its language.
Well, I like that. Very good.
So the point, I think, is concerning that there's some contradictions within the Bible about whether there was a single language or multiple languages or dialects.
I like that. That's a very interesting point. So you're pointing out that in terms of the chronology of biblical literature, we have already a division, a multiplicity of languages before we get to chapter 11 of the Tower of Babel story, right?
Yes.
And one way around that, if that's a good way of putting it, is that the Bible here resists a chronological reading. We have this genealogy in chapter 10 in which we have separation. Then the Tower of Babel story is not a continuation of the chronology, but what we might call a myth. A myth which tries to tell us something out of time. And if that's plausible, then the chronological issue disappears. But we can always, I could say this, and an adequate retort might be, yeah, but now you're leaving the Bible. I thought we were interpreting the Bible. So one has to be willing, one has to feel that the Tower of Babel story is not just the next episode, but really a story about something that transcends time and space. And if we can accept that, then the contradiction is solved. If we can't, then it remains. Jim?
I'm somewhat amused because what he describes here in his very first sentence, indeed the order was too perfect. This goes on every day in construction, this exact sequence of events.
Yeah.
First you have the architects, and if you have more than one, you immediately have a problem. Then you have the city officials who throw in their 2 cents. And then you've got all the suppliers, well, my product's better than yours. And then you have some other entity come in and said, well, we just developed a new product. And this is before anything's even drawn on paper that the building's going to get going.
Yeah.
So this goes on every day. This is not some fantasy here. As far as the actual construction, I don't think that's the point of what we're doing, but it's somewhat amusing to me that he's got it down exactly what happens every time you go to put a building up.
And your phrase, every time,
Yeah. And it has nothing to do with language, because on a given project, let's say I'm involved in right now, everybody's speaking English,
yeah.
but you can't get anything done.
Yeah. So the problem of language, and I don't know that is he really dealing with the problem of language in his narrative?
No, I think he's describing the immediate conflict because the real situation is one person can't do it. You need all these people, but in spite of the fact you need all these people, it's nearly impossible to get them together.
Yeah. So here's how I understand where you have taken us. We now have 3 levels of narrative. We have the biblical story, then we have Kafka's interpretation of the biblical story, then we have Jim coming in and giving us an illustration from your own work, pointing to the appropriateness, the power of Kafka's interpretation of the biblical story. It's as if we were to invite Kafka to a service one night. You're sitting in the front row, and I read this biblical story, and then we say, and we happen to have here Franz Kafka to come up and to give us his reading of it, and he does it. At which point Jim raises his hand. Jim, you have something you want to add? Come on up. Jim comes up to the bema and says, let me tell you how true this narrative is. Because in my own experience, in the year 2022, just what Kafka is detailing here at the beginning of the story is true in my own life. So that, what's the congregation's response to these 3 narratives? I'm reading the biblical story. That's what the rabbis do. Then we have Franz Kafka. Hey, wait a minute now. There's an additional power to this story and what he does. Then we have Jim come up and say, this is the way it is. Now everybody says, wait a minute here, Jim is right. This happens in my own world, in my own life. How universal is this story? No, I'd like that very much. Jordan?
We have real world experiences of building over centuries. All the cathedrals were not built in one person's lifetime. They were 2 or 3 centuries. And now we have a modern rehab of Notre Dame that were inspired with new technologies, but they're going back to old ways.
Yeah.
But the fact that you could build a cathedral with over the centuries is itself remarkable.
And what point are you making here, that Kafka's over the centuries really has modern application?
It wasn't too modern back then. It was done before Kafka started writing.
But post-biblical by a long shot,
Right.
even up to today. So building projects, yeah. Is that the point that you're making?
No, it can't take centuries.
That again increases the universality of what he's writing about. Stuart, and then Russell. Sorry.
Kafka was writing before 1924.
Right.
So about a century ago. He was a Czech Jew who spoke German and Czech and wrote in both languages. And we are reading an English translation which may or may not be accurate.
No? Right, I mean, right. Well, that's the problem with translation in general. And we have faced this in our poetry sessions, where poetry depends on language even more acutely. And therefore, translation is all the more problematic. But what choice do we have?
Yeah, and to the point that was raised about Notre Dame, a lot of the materials are not available anymore. So we have to use contemporary availability.
Right. And what point does that make? Just that it is the case?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Which may get back to Jim's problem, because when they're rebuilding the cathedral, there are probably many suppliers who are talking about the appropriateness of their particular wares.
It goes on every day right now.
Yeah, for sure.
As certain things become, for instance, asbestos is not allowed to be used. Well, some building codes still say you have to use it.
Yeah.
And immediately, everybody throws their hands up and nothing gets done.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so let's do this. Let's turn now back to Abraham. And with the Tower of Babel, Russell. Okay, very good, sorry.
A little different perspective, that perhaps there's another story in the Bible that comments on Babel and gives some hope for its solution. And that's the story of Jacob's stream, where there's a ladder between heaven and earth.
Yeah.
With the angels going down and up.
Yeah.
And Jacob says, oh, it's a holy place and I didn't know it. Well, it's a holy place and a holy path, and perhaps trying, instead of building up to God, that the path to God is coming down through revelation, covenant, the Torah, and that gives us a way to get up to heaven.
I like that. Well, that's great. So that, let me re-describe what you've said, see if you accept that. What is absent in the first 11 chapters, an acknowledgement of the coming down of God, and therefore the need for a going up response. It's a response. I love your pointer, because that's what the Torah says. The angels go down and up. So down is first. So you seem to be making the point here that one of the revolutions that comes from Abrahamic religion is the recognition of the power of the coming down, which then requires a going up as a response. God says X, we say yes. I like that. So for you, an antidote to the Tower of Babel story is Jacob's ladder as another kind of myth. Not a tower, but a ladder, understood in certain ways. Both of them connect heaven and earth. Well, yeah. Well, is that the end of Torah study? Have we arrived? Yeah. Franz, help us. Make it more complicated. Okay, so, very good. I like that very much. Let's now go to chapter 12. Whereas in this context, it seems to me that it is even more striking. So the Lord said to Avram, go forth from your native land, from your father's house, the land that I will show you. Out of the blue, God comes into Abraham's life, which has just been what we might call a human-oriented journey. And now all of a sudden, another element is added into his journey. God coming down, in Russell's language here. God initiates it. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. Verse 4 in Hebrew. Vayelech Avram, and Abraham went. God came down and said, go, I've got a new thing for you. And Abraham said, yes. I often ask the kids when I'm doing this with confirmation students, would you have gone? If you had felt that God spoke to you and said, embark on an adventure, and I take it most of us would be skeptical of it. Notice here, Abraham is completely accepting. It just says, God finishes speaking at the end of verse 3. And the first thing we see in response is, Vayelech Avram. The very first word is the verb of going. In Hebrew, and he went, Avram. First we have the action, then we have, of course it's Hebrew syntax, but nevertheless we could say the action is a pure response to the call. It's as if in Russell's terms, God came down and Abraham immediately went up. Abraham, of course now it's not going up, it's going forth. So let's call this a leap of faith. Abraham doesn't question, Abraham doesn't delay, Abraham says yes. So here we have the classic leap of faith. What Rosenzweig calls derisively, he doesn't like this idea, a somersault into faith. And I think that's an especially picturesque way of saying it. God called and Abraham just leapt forward. So the question is, in response to what has happened in the first 11 chapters, what's the status of this interaction? God comes out and speaks for the first time with a direction. Well, he does say to Noah to build the ark and so on. It's not that the whole thing is directionless. And Abraham says yes. So is that what it's all about? And here's my suggestion. That the Bible's notion, now I'm going to speak for the biblical author, which is always perilous. The first thing we have to do is say yes. And we have to say it unequivocally. We have to leap onto the paradigm. Once we've leapt onto the paradigm, other things happen which may cause us to wonder about certain elements of the paradigm. And Abraham is going to have adventures, which can be divided into two categories. Things that happen to him that might make him wonder, and things that he does because of puzzlement about the nature of the paradigm. But both of those things, let's call them both examples of complication. The complexities that confront a person who has said yes. In other words, saying yes, I want to suggest, for the Bible, is a precondition for everything else. But that's not the end of the matter, because life is more complicated than yes. Yes is going to be accompanied by questions, by doubt, by things that seem to go against what we might think that yes implies. But first has to be yes. So let me put it this way. There is belief and there's doubt. Descartes thought that doubt comes first. I'm going to doubt everything. And from this doubt, I'm going to see if I can derive or arrive at affirmation. He finds a way, it's a specious way, it's something like, well, I'm the one doubting, and therefore one thing I do know is that I exist. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Could I be dreaming? Which is a good question. Can we prove we're not dreaming this whole life of ours? But God, Descartes says, wouldn't deceive me, and therefore it's true that I exist. And this is the foundation of knowledge. What Descartes does is starts with no and tries to build yes. And the question is, does it work? Abraham starts with yes and then allows elements of no to creep in, but starting with a framework in which he believes. That's what I want to say. The no's, the doubts, the skepticism have a role which is not fully corrosive. From doubt, no assertions can confidently be made. From assertions, doubts can be allowed in, but you still have something solid. That's what I want to suggest is going on here. Abraham says yes and embarks on the Jewish adventure. And it suggests the power of the primacy of affirmation. Belief allows doubt, mature belief. And I think that Abraham's belief is a mature belief. Belief allows doubt, but doubt makes fully embodied belief harder. And I think that's the Bible's argument. So let's try it out. Let's go back to verse 2. Here are the promises. I'll make you a great nation. That's promise number 1. What is a necessary condition for becoming a great nation? Here's the answer. The next generation. You can't have a great nation unless from the first generation you get a second generation. So this is the promise of progeny. And you know that becomes a big issue in the Abraham and Sarah stories, the delay of progeny. But this is a promise. I will bless you. I will make your name great. That's the opposite of what the Babylonites did. They wanted to make their own name. Now we're getting the opposite. Your name, this is in a way Russell's point again. If you'll accept the coming down, that's a guarantee of your great name. If you allow God to be attached to your life, then God, your connection to God, is the source of your great name. If it's all about building up, is that the gesture? You can't do enough to make your name great, as the Tower of Babel story, Kafka especially, detailed for us. You shall be a blessing. I'll bless those that curse you, and curse them and curse them. All the families will bless themselves by you. So this is the promise of some universal harmony whose basic instrument is Abraham. Not only as an individual, but as the progenitor of a community whose task is to bring blessing. So the whole question of chapters 1 through 11 is that God's hope for the harmony of the human family is not realized. God doesn't have Jews yet in the first 11 chapters. God's hope is in humanity. Noah stands for humanity. Adam and Eve, the Tower of Babel, is humanity. So that God seems to recognize that if his goal is human coherence and harmony, he's going to have to find a new set of means, of instruments for bringing that about. And the call of Abraham is that instrument. Through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So these promises already indicate the hope for a solution to some of the issues left unresolved in chapters 1 through 11. And Abraham went. And then verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, I'll assign this land to you and to your offspring. Let's imagine that we're Abraham here. We just heard verse 7. What do we do? Well, here's what Abraham did. And he built an altar to the Lord. That's another. God comes down and Abraham says yes. The building of the altar is the acceptance of the reality of that promise. So notice, two of the promises already at the beginning are progeny and land. Think about the end of the Abraham story. Chapters 23 and 24, after the binding of Isaac. Chapter 23, Abraham seeks a burial place for Sarah. And you remember this discussion he has with Ephron. Ephron says, look, we'll loan it to you. Use some of our property. Abraham insists on buying it. That's the beginning of the realization of the promise indicated in verse 7 of land. And how does that promise begin to come about? I'm going to use Russell's image again. By Abraham going up. God said, I'm going to do this for you. And Abraham has to wonder, how is this going to come about? Is God going to give me the land? Or is God going to promise the land? But wait a minute. Maybe I have to make a gesture as well. It's not just enough for God to make the promise coming down. We have to respond by going up. Abraham is the beginning of the fulfillment of that promise on his own. Chapter 24. Abraham sends his senior servant to get a wife for Isaac. I will make you a great nation. The beginning of the realizations of those two promises is a result of Abraham's actions. And what are those actions? I want to build a house. I see some land there. And I go to the land office and they tell me, yeah, nobody owns it yet. I buy it. Why do I do that? Because I wanted to build a house. Abraham doesn't buy the land because he wants to build a house. Abraham buys the land because he has already accepted the basic premises of his relationship with God. It's all implied in the beginning of chapter 12. Abraham says yes. But yes doesn't mean I can just sit back and do nothing. Yes means I've got to act. But my action is always in the context of that assumption set, of that framework. That framework empowers Abraham to act. In other words, faith doesn't mean stepping back. Faith means stepping forward in an act of response to the faith that you've had. Don't you think this is a powerful argument for a certain kind of faith? A bold faith, a faith of stepping forward. Now let's turn to verse 10. There was a famine in the land. Here's Abraham. I've said yes. Now I'm God's person. Things are going to be great. Because this is the God of the universe. He makes these big promises. I said yes, I build an altar, and everything is fine. And now the rest is just living out my life. Verse 10, no. There are huge problems for us, people of faith. Don't think that this is a rose garden. A famine. Somebody comes and steals my plum tree. What's the cause of this? My neighbor. There's a famine. What's the cause of that? God. God runs the universe. He brings the rain, he holds back the rain. So as soon as Abraham says yes to God, God's world presents a dilemma to Abraham. I mean, think of the imagination of the author here, who I'm just listening to Mahler's Fifth Symphony. And the fourth movement of the Fifth Symphony, the Adagietto, is a beautiful love song to Alma. The third movement is full of turmoil. I think Mahler said about that, this will keep the commentators busy for a long time. Verse 10 of chapter 12, which movement of the Fifth Symphony does it embody? Not the fourth movement. Not the lovely, melodic, harmonious love song. If Mahler were writing the chapter 12 of Genesis, and he had already finished up to verse 9, and he said, now what shall verse 10 be? Is it going to be my fourth movement or my third movement? I don't know what Mahler would have chosen, but I know what the author chose, the third movement. True? It's not the end of the Sixth Symphony. Some of you know Mahler's Sixth Symphony, which ends on a huge dissonance and then little taps on the timpani. That is full skepticism. It's one of the most courageous things in all of music, the end of the Sixth Symphony. That's not verse 10. Verse 10 doesn't despair, but it presents an impediment. Don't you think? Famine by itself is an obstacle. But there's another obstacle which the obstacle itself creates. What is Abraham going to do by way of response? Well, his first move is to leave the land of Canaan to a land where there's not a famine. That's Egypt. That's not a very good solution because Sarah's beautiful and alluring, and he's alone. So Abraham has to make a choice already. Abraham's faith doesn't mean just sitting back and coming to the Kabbalat Shabbat service every week and singing Ma Tovu. It means confronted with excruciating dilemmas. Now, how does Abraham respond to that dilemma? Well, we might say, look, he had to do something, and he did the right thing. Or we might say he did the wrong thing. He exposed Sarah. He used Sarah as an instrument. How terrible. We could argue about this. What I think is crucial here is that already this man of faith, before chapter 12 is over, is already facing challenges from God's world and from the human world. And I think I'll go to the synagogue and get down on my knees and ask God to give me a solution to this problem. I've cast my lot with God. Now I'm going to just start praying. Grant me an insight here. I'm waiting. No, Abraham doesn't wait for God. Abraham acts. It strikes me that the need to act and his capacity to act is as important as the nature and the quality of that act, which itself is problematic. What kind of faith is at work here? Don't you think it's really quite astonishing? Let's go here next to chapter 13. So that verse 5 of chapter 13, Lot, who went with Abraham brought his nephew with him, remember? Also had flocks and herds. This is a little resonant of the Kafka stuff. There's conflict now. So that the land could not support them staying together. What happened to this rosy idea of God making all these great promises and Abraham saying yes? as if that's the end of the story. The rest of it is just filler. No, the rest of it shows what this kind of faith requires. For their possessions were so great that they couldn't remain together. And there with Jim's point about Kafka's description is my description every day in my work. Kafka's notion of peoples living together, having conflicts, inevitable conflicts, is what we're dealing with here, right? Through a narrative. One specific example of a perennial matter of people being together and having to make choices, and the issue of scarcity. We both can't have everything we want. Scarcity is a condition of what it means to be human, and therefore we tend to wrestle over scarce resources. And there was quarreling, verse 7, between the herdsmen of Avram's cattle and those of Lot's. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling there. And Abraham said to Lot, Abraham says, I have got to come up with a solution here. The solution is not given to me. The solution is not obvious. I have to make a choice. And I'm going to belabor this point, but the choice is made more possible because Abraham already has his framework. That he's got a sense of connection to God, who, even though circumstances may put pressure on it, emboldens him. And Avram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, between my kinsmen and yours, for we are kinsmen. We are, what's the word in Hebrew? We are achim anachnu. We're brothers. Which is true if we all come from Adam and Eve. Is not the whole land before you? Let us separate. If you go north, I'll go south. If you go south, I'll go north. In other words, we want to solve this problem. Here are the choices. I'll give you the choice. It's an act of generosity. We might ask, I'm going to overreach here, I know it. What emboldens Abraham to give the choice to Lot? Where does the generosity come from? Here's where the overreach might be. Because he already realizes that his life has meaning. And it's a meaning that is the foundation of the possibility of certain ways of living in the world. His faith, his sense that God has called him, and he's got a vocation, emboldens the generosity. If I heard you say that, I would raise my hand and say, wait a minute, you can't, what? That's too big a conclusion. True. But still, it's alluring, isn't it? What does Abraham's leap of faith enable? Lot, verse 10, looked about him and so on, and so he makes a choice. Chapter 14, he does some stuff. Here comes chapter 15. Sometime later, the word of the Lord came to Avram in a vision. Fear not, Avram, I'm a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. Well, God comes back in and says, I'm going to reiterate what I told you before. Now, in chapter 12, God said, go, and Abraham went. Here, God said, I'm going to give this stuff to you. Abraham doesn't just respond the same way. But Avram said, O Lord God, what can you give me, seeing that I shall die childless? And the one in charge of my house is Damasek Eliezer. Abraham is challenging God's promise. It seems implausible to me, Abraham said, that at this age of mine and Sarah's, that I'm going to have progeny. You're repeating what you told me. I said yes at first, but now that I've said yes, I'm going to be skeptical. Skepticism is not forbidden in this understanding of faith. Since you have granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir. By the way, I don't have any children, but I do have an assistant. What this must mean is, I see what you meant. It's not necessarily through my biology, it's through my group. The word of the Lord came to him, no, this one shall not be your heir. None but your very own issue shall be your heir. So here's what's happened here. God says, don't be afraid, your reward will be great. Abraham says, I don't believe it. What's God's response to that? Not, I'm God and you're not. I told you this is the way it's going to be. How can you say no to this? That's not what God said to Abraham, who said, no, I doubt this. God accepted the cogency of Abraham's response. The God in whom Abraham believes tolerates skepticism, as long as there's some fundamental affirmation. That's my addition. He took him outside, verse 5, and said, look toward the heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them. What does God do? Well, God has some choices. How dare you? Or, look, I'm God and you're not. I made this promise to you. I'm not upset. I just made the promise. Accept it. No. God offers a demonstration of his claim. I agree, Abraham. You need some evidence. Promises are not enough in this framework. I'm God, but you're not nothing. You're my partner here, and I'm going to accept your concerns. So he goes into the laboratory, and he does a demonstration in the laboratory. Look toward the heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them. So shall your offspring be. Now that is a brilliant demonstration. Look at the universe, and could you have made all of those? Look at all those stars up there. Could you have made that? I made it. If I could do this, I can give Sarah an offspring at the age of 90. Okay? But to me, it's much less important what the demonstration is, that God agrees that a demonstration is necessary. Because Abraham is raising a good point. So, and because he put his trust in the Lord, this is chapter 12 again, but now in a much more complicated environment. Chapter 12, God said, yes. This is what I'm glad. Abraham said yes. Okay? That's the first crucial move. Within that move, now getting Abraham to say yes may be more complicated. God is maybe going to have to work at it a little bit. But Abraham, finally, he put his trust in the Lord, and he reckoned it to his merit. Now, this is a verse that the early Christian apologists made a great deal of, because Abraham is now justified in the idea of presence of God without the law, without Torah. Just because he has faith, trust, he's already reconciled with God, justified, your merit. And this is what St. Paul uses as an illustration of the fact that faith is sufficient, the law, Torah, is unnecessary. That's a midrash for Christian purposes. It's a brilliant midrash. So Paul is also one of the early great readers of the Bible. And he said to him, I'm the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to assign this land to you as a possession. And he said, gosh, how shall I know that I am to possess it? Seems improbable that I, a small little person, am going to possess this. So he puts him to sleep. He has a dream. Verse 13, know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years, but I'll execute judgment on that nation. They say, you promised me a land. Now I see what you meant. You meant not necessarily me, but my offspring. And the proof is, if it's a proof, it certainly doesn't have the cogency of the first proof about looking up at the stars, is that history is a process. And you can't get everything you want overnight. It's going to take half a millennium. But all of this is going to happen, but you guys are coming back. You misunderstood, Abraham, what I meant by you will inherit the land. I didn't mean you. I meant you. I meant the Abrahamic adventure. And those people who are continuing that adventure a half a millennium from now, they're going to get the land. What, when I promised to you, you may think I meant tomorrow? Let's think of what a promise means, especially a big one. So Abraham and God are both working out the details of this arrangement. And it's not only God who acts, it's Abraham who acts. And God tolerates Abraham's resistance and the need for an explanation. And so on. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace and buried in a ripe old age, and they shall return here in the 4th generation. Now, if we had more time, which we don't, but maybe we'll try to continue it in a couple of weeks. In what sense is what we have discussed so far a response to the dilemmas we're left with at the end of chapter 11? Maybe Russell's idea in a nutshell. Maybe Jim and Ray. I mean, we've put it together in a way. Complexities are all about everywhere. We've got to face them and try to survive and do the best. And maybe coming down must precede going up. That was the mistake the Babylonites made. Maybe going up comes first. No, going up is you're exceeding what, but receiving the coming down, the gift, now you can go up. Only in the context of having accepted the coming down. We're on a roll here. Harry.
Yeah, I'm trying to find a relationship between chapter 11, which is the story of Babel, and chapter 12, which is the emergence of Abraham. There seem to be many generations difference between them. Yeah. Is the idea that after Babel, the Jewish people are basically wiped out, don't exist anymore, being scattered all over the earth, and that this is an entirely new, in other words, has God given up on us, and this is an entirely new chapter in the case of Abraham, which is what is ultimately going to lead to the ascension of the Jewish people.
I think you've described it exactly right, except when you said that the Jewish people is part of what's being scattered, but there are no Jewish people yet.
Well,
it's the universal humankind that is now in this quandary, from which God chooses one family. Do you accept that as the description of the story?
Yes. Yes, but it's one out of how many?
One out of how many what? People?
People, yeah.
I'm going to tell you the answer and see if you buy it. God made a choice of one people, that line that is at the end of chapter 11, moving from Ur up to Haran on the way to Canaan, but their trip is interrupted, at which point God calls just that family through Abraham to continue now on a new basis. What do you think of that?
Well, I suppose you could rationalize it that way.
Why does it need rationalization?
Nothing in common.
I'm sorry?
You could just conjure up one family. You don't need to have Babel ahead of that at all. You could just say the Jewish people starts with Abraham, period.
Period. Is your question, why doesn't the Bible just bite the bullet and start with Abraham and not all of it?
It could be yeah.
Yeah. And I think the answer is, of course it could have. But I think, this is what I've been arguing, that if we just started with Abraham, first of all, we'd have trouble moving to a universalism. What the Bible starts with a universalism, that it's all humanity that is God's interest. And that strikes me as an important thing. The second thing to say is, if Abraham is just called right at the beginning, then it's hard to see Abraham as a solution to a problem. And I think that the first 11 chapters present the problem. I've described it simply as human beings on their own, uninstructed. No coming down with any real gifts. And so, human beings uninstructed, in a certain way, Sinai is on the mind of these authors, because we're moving towards Sinai, where human beings now are fully instructed, and therefore have the capacity to build communities through law and institution. Abraham, in a way, is a prodigy. This is Maimonides' view, that Abraham discovered God, and as a philosopher, you can live the life of truth. And Abraham is that philosopher. The problem is very few people are philosophers. You can't build a community hoping that everybody's going to be a philosopher. I need to know, without explanation and a big argument, that when I come to a crossroads, I should stop on red. Why? Why should I? Communities can't operate if everything needs to be explained without remainder. Some things just have to be. And that's law, that's institution, that's norm. Of course, they can be perverted. Now you have the larger questions of justice and equity and so on. So don't you, Harry, do you buy this? That we have to have preliminary stories in order to provide the problem, so that Abraham can be seen as a response to the problem, and that why Abraham, that's the mystery. God just decides to take a person from a family and say, it's you. Turns out that it was a good choice for reasons that we have seen, that Abraham is bold. Abraham's not going to just take a famine and say, well, this is God's will. He's going to challenge it. He's going to respond. We do know why God chose Moses. We have stories before the calling. We don't have any stories before the calling of Abraham. So it seems out of the blue. The Midrash fills it in, but the Bible is willing just to say, there's something arbitrary here, but God finds out after the fact that it was a good choice. Lynn?
I was just going to say that the first thing that I heard him say is not understanding the transition between chapter 11 and chapter 12. What occurred between 11 and 12 that developed Abraham, and kind of what time span was there? Is that kind of what you were asking?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
The many generations.
Right. So that was the question.
What difference does it make whether it happened right away or after a long period of time?
You could have eliminated the entire Bible story and gone directly from the survivors of Noah's Ark to the Abraham story also.
Right. Or for that matter, you could have stopped right after the Cain and Abel story and decided, I've had enough of this, I'll just choose Abraham. Or right after the expulsion from the garden. Or right away when Eve said yes to the serpent. If I'm God, I've had enough. I mean, don't you think that these stories, what am I trying to say here? It's not so much a matter of chronology as it is meaning. Each story poses a different aspect of the dilemma. And therefore, we could have another story. Instead of 4 stories, we could have 6. Or instead of 4, we could have 2. I mean, there's no magic number, but Is that something of a response in terms of the length of time? How much time, or why didn't they just do it after Babel?
Yeah, I think you could take them, if needed, as separate aspects of creation, the formation of human groups, the formation of societies, yes.
Right.
If you look at them as somewhat separate, remotely related sequences,
Right.
then I think it makes more sense.
And then after Babel, we have another genealogy which shows some generations. So some time is passing until we get to Terah, Abraham's father, who now the focus narrows to just one family in this long genealogy, which then leads to Abraham. I mean, one could ask about Homer's Iliad, why not one more battle? Why not one fewer? My God, there's so much bloodshed. Why? But, in a way, some of this is arbitrary, isn't it? That may be a way of saying it. There's something arbitrary here. How many stories? Even though it makes perfect sense. I don't know. You think we've resolved the problem, Lynn?
Well, it's not for me to decide. But if you go from this abstract building a tower up to heaven to the concrete of finding a person that's going to lead, that God is choosing. So, I mean, I don't know, because I'm not as detailed in reading this, and what was in the middle, what sandwich in the middle of these two bookends.
Right.
So that's the thing that was asking, and you said remotely connected. I think it's remote too. That's why the question came up.
So for you, or for your understanding of Harry, we need a little more transition. Seems too abrupt.
If we want to understand, how this direction came about.
Yeah. I think part of the point, by the way, here is that God calls Abraham out of the blue. It's not that there's preparation for it as there is for the call of Moses. And I think that, this whole question of how do we come to a recognition of our vocation, and I guess it can happen in two ways. We thought about it a lot. We went down one path, maybe this wasn't it, and so on and so on. Sometimes it's, you wake up one morning and you say, oh my God, this is what I need to do. I'm sorry?
God wakes up one morning and
No,
decides
we wake up. In other words, we can get a sense of the direction of our lives in an instant or over a long period of time. Let's go out and just play catch. Okay, so, isn't this an amazing set of stories and questions? I mean, the author and the editor of these things, wow, what a vision. So in 2 weeks we'll do it again. Next week, this time, there's that panel for the Silver Weekend, and we'll continue. We're going to be way far behind by the time we come back. So what? Shabbat Shalom. I don't know. The whole weekend is sort of a celebration of Hello Silver and the whole episode of the time period. I'm not sure Martin Indyk is going to be on that panel. I'm not sure exactly who was involved.
Wonderful discussion.
Oh, so rich, isn't it? You just had a birthday, didn't you?
I did. A couple of years behind you.
Are you a couple of, 78? 78. Look at how well.
And you told me a few weeks ago you're singles. God, I couldn't be doing it if I had a background. I could still play. I don't think I could. Yeah, you're
good genes. Lucky, no doubt. It is a blessing.
It's in the genes, for sure. You gotta have good environment, good, nutrition.
I don't have knee problems, or hip problems, or shoulder problems.
Don't list, cut short.
Yeah. It's not of my doing, it's true. It's my, well, what they say, the biggest choice that we have, that we should be making in life is choosing the right parents. Yeah, but there's truth in that. Not that it's our choice, but we have no choice, but boy, we're lucky if we. I had a friend many years ago, not here, whose offspring all had some inherited problem, had tumors, benign tumors who developed at their brainstem, which incapacitated them, and they were all incapacitated. And you just looked at the family and said, wow, what did they do to deserve this? It's just the bad luck of the genes.
Inherited some mutations.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about.
Just have to be lucky that we're able to stand the rest. You too, Gary.
Question and answer. Time space between one story and another. It's like 9 months after conception the embryo became a fetus. And it has so many years to become a human. I don't think that is even an appropriate question, because the Bible is not a history book to examine human behavior through the history, because there are politics and other situations which cause what's happened there. Bible purpose to teach us what's happening with the human society. And Bible story, everybody overlook one sentence. It's like a detective movie. The person who commits the crime is there, but you don't pay even attention to him until the end of the movie. Build name for ourselves. That is a reason and answer. If you build something only for your own glory, it's destined to fail. If you will exclude God in any way, just His teaching, the philosophy, whatever, you're destined to fail. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, I think your point is that the Bible really is a book of ideas and lessons and not history.
Exactly.
Vignettes versus a complete chronology.
The dilemma, the problem is, if the problem is the way we're saying, is that it's presented as a history. It's not presented as a novel.
No.
So there's a chronology.
Chronology of human being development.
No, you could say that. All I'm saying is that, and I agree with you, but the fact that they're talking about the generations and the next generation and passage through history, even going to Egypt and then coming out, makes it seem to the reader possible to think about it in historical terms.
That is a different story, totally.
Yes.
It's a history, a theological history, the same way as a theological philosophy. Bible just take it for what it is, and a clever written as detective story for you to find the answer.
It's true. But you know, when genealogies, we're given genealogies, it looks like the Bible is talking about historical true passage, and that for you, that would mean if we took that too seriously, we'd be missing the point of the Bible. And yet the Bible creates the conditions for people to look at it that way. Even though the Bible, as you want to say, has something else in mind for us.
In the same way that somebody explained the reason of the lines which describe that this one lived to be 500 years, 600 years. Nobody sit and calculate it, but it's a point to show that the good people live a long life.
Yes, absolutely. But what you're doing is you're extracting from that data a meaning.
Exactly.
But one could say, well, okay, you're extracting meaning, but what about what it actually says?
That is meaning, essence is a meaning.
That's your idea.
But that's the whole purpose of writing anything. You're not writing to describe this temple as a structure, how they build it, etc. No. You writing to tell how the people, group of people, somehow consciously, spiritually come together to understand that they need this structure. Everything else is meaningless.
No, I guess I agree with you, though. If you asked an architect to talk about the building, the architect would be talking about specifications.
Jim's description.
And you would
Which
say, well, what's the
architect?
meaning? What's behind what you're saying? He would say, nothing. I'm talking about the detail.
What kind of architect? The one who is come from the Christian or Muslim faith or Jewish faith?
What difference does it make?
Its appearance, its structure to reflect historical elements of what it was for Jews, for Christian, and for Muslim.
No, I agree with you. All I'm saying is that...
But the purpose is why the people building it.
I get your point. All I'm saying is that if you looked at the architect's drawings for the building, the Hartzmark Room, and you saw them, this is 40 feet, and windows, and well, what's the meaning? What's the meaning? And he would say, as an architect, I'm not interested in them.
Therefore, I don't need you as an architect. I'm serious. I'm serious.
In a sense, it's a question of levels, like you mentioned with Jim. There's Babel in itself is a very Reader's Digest condensed metaphor for human society, for community.
Yeah.
And Jim would be a sidebar. By the way, here's what happens that causes complications in the building of this. And what you're saying is true also. Kafka gives us well, the reason is they thought, I don't need to complete this in my lifetime. They can procrastinate.